66, issued in 1993 by President Bill Clinton. The statement concludes that the regulatory system falls short of these goals. That is truer today than it was 18 years ago. From the lighting in their homes, to the volume of their television sets, to the cars they buy, Americans today are facing an unprecedented tide of red tape in their lives. Red tape that is increasing prices, reducing innovation, and destroying jobs. Last fiscal year, the number and cost of new regulations imposed by federal agencies reached unprecedented levels. Based upon reports from the Government Accountability Office, in fiscal year 2010 alone, some 43 major new rules increasing regulatory burdens were issued by federal agencies. That is higher than any other year on record. The total annual cost for these rules, based on estimates by the regulators themselves, tops $26.5 billion, the highest level since at least 1981, the earliest date for which records are available. Many more on the way. The costs imposed by these rules vary as much as the regulations themselves. One cost, perhaps surprisingly to many, is in decreased safety. It can be in terms of decreased safety. Several members mentioned safety concerns, as they should, in the discussion during the first panel, and certainly many regulations are essential to preserving safety. But we shouldn't forget that safety can also be decreased by regulations. It can be a cost. That points specifically to CAFE rules, fuel economy rules that have forced Americans into smaller, less safe vehicles, causing many deaths, and even airline safety, where specifically such rules as child safety seats have induced Americans to drive rather than fly, moving them to a less safe mode of transportation. Our specific subject here today is the cost in terms of jobs. Now, you've heard from many other witnesses how many jobs may be destroyed or not created because of particular regulations. But no businessman needs an academic study to know how regulations affect their bottom line and can stop them from hiring new workers. A couple of points I want to stress, though. First, economic studies can only capture effects on existing industries, or at least predictable industries and technologies. The dogs that don't bark are not counted. New technologies that are stunted, new products that are never brought to market, and ideas that never are acted upon don't make it into the statistics, yet these are real costs of regulation. Also, I want to point out that regulations can create jobs as well as eliminate them, but this is not always a good thing. For instance, a new regulation can, and in fact usually does, create more demand for lawyers, lobbyists, and even regulators themselves. This may increase the job roles, but is not an increase in wealth or prosperity for society. For the same reason, policymakers should be wary of claims about new rules creating green jobs. Green jobs can be productive, can increase wealth in society, but not if those jobs are based on artificial mandates or restrictions that are not otherwise justified. If they are justified only in terms of creating the job, they add nothing to prosperity. So that is something for policymakers to watch out for. The bottom line, it's critical that policymakers increase scrutiny of new and existing rules to ensure that each is necessary and that costs are minimized. President Obama has recognized this, and it's taken a welcome first step towards reform by announcing that his administration would look harder at new rules, at existing rules that are already in the books. I'm a little bit concerned, however, that review is not stringent enough. In fact, if you look at the language of the executive order issued by the President, it only asked agencies to come up with a preliminary plan for regulations to review, rather than to come up with actions directly. It is a very small first step. And the fact that it does not include independent agencies, which are some of the primary producers of new regulations and regulations on the books, is a matter of concern and a loophole in this review. Let me just say to follow up, I'm encouraged by the actions of this committee and the work in focusing attention on this important problem, and in identifying and asking for information from businesses who are affected by regulation and by the public in getting information. Lastly, I have several legislative proposals I think the committee should look at. Let me just list them. I think Congress should be required to approve all new rules in order to increase accountability. I think that there should be a regulatory impact statement prepared by a new Congressional Regulation Office to allow Congress to provide more information, get more information about rules. And lastly, there should be a sunset period for all rules after, say, 5 or 6 years in order to ensure that they are doing their job and that bad rules are taken off the books. With that, again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Shapiro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regulatory critics contend the cost of regulation has kept the U.S. business community from participating more fully in our nation's economic recovery. Upon examination, however, it turns out that a focus on regulatory costs is a flawed way to examine the usefulness and necessity of government regulation, or to determine whether or not regulatory costs are hindering the nation's economic recovery. The focus on regulatory costs is misguided for 4 reasons. First, as we heard discussed in the last panel this morning, the cost of regulation in isolation proves nothing because it ignores the benefits that regulation brings to the public and the economy. The best measure of this is the OMB report submitted annually to Congress. The last one, covering the last 10 years of major federal regulations, found total benefits of between $128 and $616 billion and costs of no more than $43 to $55 billion. Now, this finding refers to aggregate net benefits, which means that some individual regulations may not have benefits that exceed costs. But in our experience, this result usually results from the difficulty of monetizing regulatory benefits rather than the lack of any such benefits. Second, retrospective studies show that industry estimates of regulatory costs submitted to agencies for purposes of rulemaking are often too high. This result should not be surprising. Regulated entities have strong incentives to overstate potential costs to regulators and to Congress. As Representative Quigley pointed out, the National Association of Manufacturers had dire predictions for the Clean Air Act, none of which were borne out. Third, a recent study on regulatory costs authored by Nicole and Mark Crane for the SBA Office of Advocacy, which claims regulation had an annual cost of $1.75 trillion in 2008, is unreliable evidence concerning regulatory costs. I discuss this study in detail in my written testimony. Let me mention only one problem. About 70% of the regulatory costs estimated by Crane and Crane are based largely on a decidedly unusual data source for economists, public opinion polling, the results of which Crane and Crane massage into a massive but unsupported estimate of the costs of economic regulation. Because Crane and Crane have refused to make their underlying data or calculations public, apparently even withholding them from the Small Business Administration office that contracted for the study, it's difficult to know precisely how they arrived at the result that economic regulation has a cost of $1.2 trillion. Nevertheless, based on what we know, we should be wary of their claim. As mentioned, their estimate of economic regulatory costs is based on the results of public opinion polling, specifically polls concerning the business climate of countries that's been collected in a World Bank report. The authors of the World Bank report warned that its results should not be used for exactly the type of extrapolations made by Crane and Crane because their underlying data are too crude. Finally, like any spending, the costs of regulation generate economic activity because the money is spent on goods and services, thereby generating jobs. As also pointed out this morning, the literature does not support the conclusion that regulation retards economic recovery. In my written testimony, I described some of the studies finding that regulation does not lead to a net job loss. One of these studies, by Resources for the Future, concludes that the claim that regulatory spending, quote, reduces employment in heavily polluting industries is not supported by the data. I might note that this includes petroleum refining, which was discussed this morning as being disadvantaged by regulation. I would also like to point out that studies by Eben Goodstein, also mentioned this morning, talking about pollution havens and why jobs are sent overseas. Dr. Goodstein found that the large amount of the percentage of difference in costs between manufacturing jobs here and in places like India and China are related to wages, and that only maybe 1 or 2% of the difference in cost between manufacturing abroad and manufacturing here can be related to regulation. So I thank you for the opportunity to testify. Although it's clear that regulated entities do not always like regulation, this does not mean that regulation is the cause or even a contributor to our economic and unemployment woes. The evidence to back up this claim is simply not there.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Kerrigan.
Good afternoon, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. We appreciate the opportunity to be part of this hearing today, and we thank you for your leadership in drawing attention to the issue of regulatory impediments to job creation. Over the past several years, the regulatory pendulum has swung in a direction that is of great concern to small businesses. During the most challenging period of the recession, where business owners were experiencing very weak sales, tight credit, along with other competitive business pressures, Washington churned out an array of costly policies that served to compound the poor confidence and outlook that was so pervasive in the small business community. The fear associated with economic stability, along with a highly active government, where such actions create uncertainty and new costs, has not been conducive to investment and job creation. Now, with some improvement in the economy, there are signs that business outlook is also improving somewhat. Certainly, the new tone and recent initiatives from the White House, including the new regulatory strategy, is a welcome sign. But we must remember that the regulatory agencies will remain highly active and in areas with economy-wide impact. For example, they are at work implementing the healthcare law, the new healthcare law, which many small business owners are concerned about with respect to its cost. There are other significant regulations and activity underway at the EPA, the Department of Labor, and other agencies. So given the fact that existing regulatory initiatives are in motion and small businesses remain concerned about their costs, they will also remain skittish about hiring. They have real concerns about direct and indirect costs associated with these regulations that are currently in the pipeline. I've noted in my testimony the specific concerns about the new health care law, the Affordable Care Act, both the known and the unknowns that will impact hiring decisions in the short and long term. With respect to the cost of energy, business owners are worried about gas and electricity prices. Along with new EPA regulations that will raise prices, they see what is occurring with offshore drilling bans, delayed permits, and how various players in our energy industry are being affected by the Federal Government switching course on production projects, which will affect the supply and price of energy. I also would mention that this will affect the many small players that operate in this industry, in the energy industry, and the thousands of small businesses whose livelihoods are dependent upon a vibrant energy sector. Over at the Department of Labor, there is a departure away from helping businesses comply with the law toward an approach that seems more focused on generating complaints and grievances and collecting penalties and fines. The Department's new Plan, Protect, Prevent regulatory initiatives has the potential to add vast amount of paperwork and time-consuming work for small businesses. So as a small business owner, you're not only continue to look at the uncertainty of the economy, you are also looking at new regulation and costs that will permeate your entire business: labor, energy, financial services, the cost and availability of credit and capital, the cost of raw materials and supplies, health coverage, and a boatload of new paperwork. And this is on top of a regulatory framework that is already burdensome for small businesses. And make no mistake, small businesses are disproportionately impacted by regulation. This has been documented by the fine work and the peer-reviewed work of the Small Business Office of Advocacy, showing that the per-employee cost of regulation for small business is 36% higher than for larger firms. The cumulative cost of regulation is putting U.S. businesses at a competitive disadvantage. Particularly in this tough economic period, it is deterring job creation. President Obama wants to make the U.S. the best place in the world to do business, and we do share that goal. But the U.S. will not maintain or improve its status under the current regulatory approach. So we look forward to working with the committee and Congress on solutions to improve the regulatory system and help small businesses do what they do best, and that is to innovate, add value, and create jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ellig.
Thank you, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jerry Ellig. I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I've also served in 2 out of 3 branches of the United States government. I was a senior economist at the Joint Economic Committee on Capitol Hill some years ago and served as Deputy Director of the Office of Policy Planning at the Federal Trade Commission. I don't envy the members of this committee or staff of this committee trying to grapple with this issue. You've recently received about 2,000 pages of submissions in response to Chairman Issa's initial requests, and it looks like more is on the way via the website. You've already heard a lot of conflicting claims, and you're going to hear more conflicting claims. You're going to hear conflicting claims from advocates who say that regulation is all benefit and no cost, and you're going to hear claims from people who say that regulation is all cost and no benefit. Particularly to committee staff, I want to say, having been in government, I've walked a mile in your moccasins and I feel your pain. You've heard a lot of conflicting claims. You'll hear more. Well, as Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was reputed to have said, everybody's entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. So how do we actually get the facts about the effects of regulation, both the benefit side and the cost side? How do we get a better grip on what regulation produces that we like, and also the things we have to give up in order to get that? Well, the Federal Government already has a long-standing method for doing this. It's laid out in presidential executive orders. President Obama's recent executive order reiterated and reaffirmed these standards for assessing the effects of regulations. It's also laid out in guidance from the Office of Management and Budget in a document called Circular A4. Presidents of both parties have issued these executive orders, laid out procedures for agencies to analyze regulations, laid out processes for regulatory review, and this has been going on for decades, so this is not new. A good regulatory impact analysis, which is what these documents are about, a good regulatory impact analysis gives us answers to questions like, what outcomes of direct value to the public does the regulation produce? Not just compliance, not just enforcement, but what actual results that the public benefits from are produced. What failure of the private market or failure of previous policy or other systemic problem is the regulation likely to solve? Systemic problem, not just are there a few anecdotes or are there a few bad actors that could be dealt with on a case-by-case basis? What are the alternative solutions? Because regulation is rarely a yes-no on-off switch. There are alternative ways to do things that we should be looking at. And finally, what are the pros and cons of the alternatives, or in economics jargon, costs and benefits? These are the kinds of things that people are arguing about in front of this hearing, and this creates kind of a puzzle, because if Federal regulatory agencies are already supposed to be assessing the effects of regulation, why do businesses, why do advocacy organizations, why do other kinds of interested parties feel like they have to come to Congress for redress? Why didn't the agencies sort this all out when they issued the regulations? Part of the answer, I think, is that agencies often don't do the kind of comprehensive, high-quality analysis that fully identifies all of a regulation's effects. Experience shows that it takes more than words in an executive order to get good analysis done, or for good analysis to get used when agencies issue regulations. Since 2008, some of my colleagues and I at the Mercatus Center have had a project that we call the Regulatory Report Card, where we assess the quality of analysis that Federal agencies do when they issue regulations and the extent to which the agencies claim to use that when they make their decisions. This is a project on assessing the quality and completeness of the analysis, not a project on evaluating whether we like or don't like the regulations. Our criteria are drawn from Executive Order 12866, OMB Circular A4. Essentially, what the question we're trying to answer is, how well are agencies doing the things that presidents have been telling them to do for more than 30 years? Those are our criteria. We found some reasonably good analyses. We found a lot more that are seriously incomplete. If these analyses were student papers, the best grade would be a B-, the average would be an F. I don't think that's good enough to guide decisions that affect our health, that affect our safety, and affect our economy. Here are some of the common problems we find. A lot of times, believe it or not, regulations don't do a good job of explaining what outcomes the regulation is supposed to produce. A lot of times we find that there's rarely an explanation or evidence of the existence of a market failure or a systemic problem. The agency just says, well, Congress passed this law, told us to issue this regulation, so this is what we're going to do. In about half of the cases, the agencies don't identify alternative regulatory options, or they don't give them anything more than cursory analysis. And only a minority of these analyses offer a really comprehensive look at costs and benefits or explain how the regulation actually affected a decision the agency made. Now, we also find a lot of best practices that could substantially improve regulatory analysis if they were more widely shared. Clearly, the knowledge of how to do good regulatory analysis exists and is spread throughout the Federal Government. The problem is the incentives. There are institutional incentives that reduce agencies' incentive to produce good analysis and also reduce agencies' incentive to use the analysis when they do it. I have a lot of ideas in my written testimony for reforms that could help solve this problem. A few possible ideas. Require the agencies to actually explain how they use their analysis in the Federal Register notice when they propose regulations. Require agencies to publish the analysis before they write the regulation and make decisions, instead of writing the analysis after they wrote the regulation. Require them to publish the data and the models so that independent scholars or other outside folks who are interested could do their own analysis as a quality check on what the agency did. Now, I have a lot of other ideas in my written testimony. The common theme
in the Q&A, we'll give you plenty of opportunity to talk about them.
Oh, okay. No, don't worry. I wasn't going to give you another list. The bottom line is this, that in order to get good regulatory analysis and get it used, we need institutional reforms that will put teeth in the executive order.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Gattuso, in your opening statement, you talked about the President Obama's latest executive order. I have a concern. As I understand the executive order, it doesn't cover independent agencies. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So FCC, SEC, I mean, the list is, what, two-thirds of government is in regulations or in independent agencies. If you leave the EPA out, maybe more than that?
Yeah, in terms of actually calculated cost, EPA is by far the largest, but a lot of the independent agencies, especially the FCC, do not calculate cost, do not do a cost-benefit analysis. But it's the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's a long list.
You know, my industry that I came from, the electronics industry, FCC was king. And I didn't get to say this in the first round, but maybe because we have such a scholarly round, the FCC's failure to supply bandwidth solutions for more data capability that the market wants, that Mr. Cummings wants, that my constituents want, is that an impediment? I mean, are those some of the impediments where we see the FCC passing rules, but we don't see them using their assets to provide the expansion of the economy?
It certainly is an impediment. The FCC actually has improved its policies over the past decade or so, allowing more and more flexible use of a spectrum, but there's a lot still to be done. If I mention also in independent agencies that some reports have said that the President is unable legally to involve the independent agencies in his review.
So what you're saying is the President can't, but we could?
Well, no. What I'm saying is that those reports are wrong. In 1991,
so he could and we could require this.
Well, in fact, it's been done before. In 1992, President Bush had a regulatory review and moratorium in which every independent agency participated. All that was required was for the President to ask the chairman of each agency to participate. Everyone said yes, and I think President Obama could get the same result if he were to ask.
Thank you. The earlier panel talked about a particular new regulation, an EPA one, a boiler MACT, M-A-C-T. How often do you, in your analysis, see regulations where they create a regulation, then have to go to the court to try to delay it because, in fact, it can't be implemented like that one where it's, I guess in 3 days it's going to become law without there actually being technology to make it work, and they've admitted that in their own statements. Is that something that you see in other areas?
You know, I can't think of a case where that has happened before. I mean, I'm sure it has, but I think it would be extremely rare for an agency to reverse itself that significantly.
Well, they haven't reversed themselves. They've just gone to the court for relief from their own
Well, that's
rule.
true. That's true. Although they reversed themselves in the sense that they apparently did think the rule was justified, and now they're having second thoughts.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask a specific question to Mr. Shapiro. You're on record, and I quote, as saying about cost-benefit analysis, "It is neither sound in theory nor useful in practice." Now, when the President wants a cost-benefit analysis, does that mean that you disagree with President Obama when he's looking for regulatory relief that looks at cost-benefit? Or is it in your testimony today basically that you want to figure out, once something's a law, if it's got a benefit, then you should do a cost-benefit, but if you're going to make it, you shouldn't consider? I'm a little confused, because it appears as though basically you're very happy not having cost-benefit when they put the regulation on, and then when industry says it's costing us billions or millions, et cetera, that, as you said, they, quote, exaggerate, that basically they have to prove that it's killing them, or you don't want the regulation removed. Did I understand that correctly, Mr. Shapiro?
I'm not quite sure of your understanding, but perhaps.
Well, you've said cost-benefit analysis, and that quote is not a useful practice, and yet the President thinks it is. Democrats here on the dais thought it should be. Ms. Kerrigan, should we in fact have a cost-benefit analysis?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, may I answer the question?
Well, you didn't seem to be interested in answering, but I'll come back to you. Ms. Kerrigan, should we in fact, as a body, make sure that there is a cost-benefit analysis done by government, open to scrutiny, before regulation occurs, as Mr. Ellig had suggested?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's particularly important for small businesses, because they do, there is a disproportionate impact on small businesses, and I think that rigorous analysis needs to be done. So it's vitally important, and it would be a tremendous value to small businesses and the business communities if the agencies were required to do that.
Thank you. And my time has expired, but I don't want to shortchange Mr. Shapiro. Would you answer whether you still stand behind your 2009 white paper, January, in which you said the problem with, and it was so and so, and cost-benefit analysis is neither sound in theory nor useful in practice? You still stand behind that?
I do. What we were talking about.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member.
In courtesy to you, and I apologize for the Chairman, I'd like to hear your answer to his question.
Thank you. If you look at all the major laws that involve the protection of people and the environment, with only 2 exceptions that I know about, Congress does not require that a regulation pass a cost-benefit test in order to implement the regulation. There's a very good reason for that. In all of these laws, Congress wanted to be protective. It wanted to protect the American people and the environment to the extent that was practicable and reasonable, and it's therefore set the laws in having this aspirational goal. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be interested in cost-benefit analysis, because we should analyze the efficiency costs of this aspirational goal, and that's what we do in cost-benefit analysis. Unfortunately, it's difficult to apply cost-benefit analysis because many of the benefits are difficult to monetize. So while you've heard proposals here today that we should have additional analysis, we should study these things more, I don't object to that except for the caveat that we recognize going in of the great difficulty of monetizing the value of the benefits. What is a life worth? What is a fish worth? We can talk about it, but there are really severe limitations in using the methodology.
Let me ask you this. You know, it's interesting. These regulations have been put forth by both Republican and Democratic administrations, and as a former small business person, I sympathize. I really do with small business. And any business that have to go through some of these things. But as I listen to what you just said, so is it your theory, is it yours? I want to make sure I'm saying this right. When the government puts forth these regulations, are you saying that they're more concerned about the general protection of the public? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, that's correct. Many, although not all of these regulations, basically work as technology-based regulations. So what Congress has said to the agencies is we want to do the best we can to protect the American public, taking costs into account. So what we'd like you to do is go out and find the best available technology, which would not cause severe financial dislocation for an industry, and we want you to require them to use the best available technology to protect the public. That's essentially how many of these laws work.
All right, let me ask you this. A little bit earlier, I described how some of the major corporations we heard from had skyrocketing profits over the last 2 years. For example, Chevron's profits soared from $10.5 billion in 2009 to $19 billion in 2010. And ConocoPhillips' profits went from $4.4 billion to $11.4 billion, more than doubling in a year. But when we looked at the responses, a lot of these companies wanted to repeal corporate transparency provisions in the Wall Street reform bill. And these seem to have nothing to do with job creation. Let me ask you about one example. The first regulation identified by ConocoPhillips was a requirement that oil companies and other resource extraction issuers disclose their payments to foreign governments to access oil, gas, and minerals. Senator Richard Lugar, a well-respected Republican, good friend, was one of the primary proponents of this provision, and he said, "The essential issue at stake is a citizen's right to hold its government to account. We cannot force foreign governments to treat their citizens as we hope, but this amendment would make it much more difficult to hide the truth." So my first question is, why would ConocoPhillips want to keep their payments to foreign governments secret? And, well, as I understand the point of today's hearing, we are trying to identify regulations that impair job creation. So here is my second question. If we agreed with ConocoPhillips and repealed this provision, would that create any jobs in America? Mr. Shapiro?
I think this shows the reason why we need to broaden our focus beyond regulatory costs. This is a regulatory cost to those companies. So besides whatever embarrassment might come out of revealing this information, there are paperwork and other costs to the company. And there could be a debate over whether that's necessary, as you've heard before. But in order to evaluate whether that's necessary, we have to look at the broader picture of the benefits as well as the costs, benefits which are monetized or not.
Thank you.
In order to be fair, I'm going to try and do a little quick second round. I'm from the private sector, so maybe I see things differently. Mr. Shapiro, I took your yes, you still stand by it for an answer, so I was glad that the ranking member allowed you to elaborate.
Of course.
But let me understand this. You think it's a good idea for a U.S. flagged business to disclose what it pays, remembering we're one of the few countries in the world that does not allow, if you will, bribes. We make it a crime to pay a commission to somebody to get a deal. But the details of a contract, let's say in Kazakhstan or, you name the country, if the details have to be made public by a U.S. flagged company, well, BP, which is not U.S. flagged, or a Russian company doesn't, then if I understand, you think it's just fine for that legal but private private transaction to be made available to their competitors while the other isn't, meaning they always know what price they have to beat from us. Well, in fact, we don't know what price they're paying. And meantime, the French, the Russians, and all the others, on top of we don't know what they're paying, are able to pay bribes with impunity. You really think that naively on global business? Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, I was trying to make a broader point. My area of academic specialty is
so in this particular case, you're not speaking to those kinds of issues. You're thinking more broadly of regulatory compliance. Is that right?
I think we need to have the conversation that the Chairman indicated he would like to have, and that's looking at both benefits and costs.
Okay. Because I'm very concerned that the ranking member has repeatedly throughout this hearing talked about Chevron and Conoco. and other companies. I guess what he misses is the vast majority of these large increases occurred in their outside the U.S. operations. They're growing very fast on profits made by buying overseas and selling overseas, and then those look like profits in the U.S. Well, in fact, in the first panel, and I think we're hearing it broadly in the second panel, we realized that American jobs are not being created through American mining, manufacture, and agriculture, and we're here today, and I'd like to have everyone make a closing statement as to this. We're here because it appears as though part of the impediment to U.S. job creations, not U.S. profits by doing business globally and making in China and selling to Europe, but U.S. jobs, those kinds of jobs we all grew up being proud of, working at the auto, steel, and rubber plants, working at the stamping operation. Those jobs are the jobs we think may be disappearing. I'd go down the panel of, do you believe, and this is a fairly simple question, although you can elaborate, do you believe there's any credence to looking for at least one impediment to U.S. job creation here? Is that frivolous, or in fact, are we on the right track to try to get those mining, agriculture, and manufacturing jobs back in America?
I think you're definitely on the right track. There are costs. Now, that does not mean that every regulation is bad. That does not mean that no regulations are needed, but there are many that are bad, there are many that are necessary, and many that are harmful. It's not an easy task to identify those, but that's what makes the project more important. Frankly, it's the easiest thing in the world for an agency to come up with a new regulation, to get it through, and certainly all the incentives for an agency head or an agency staffer are to expand their jurisdiction.
Thank
you. We
you.
need to be vigilant to make sure that that bias is overcome.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro, to that question.
This is an important aspect of congressional oversight, and I think everyone appreciates that you're doing it, but we need to also look at the evidence. Stephen Meyer of MIT has done 2 studies. He compared economic performance in states with strict environmental regulation and economic performance in states with lesser environmental regulation, and he found that states with stronger environmental regulation had little difference in economic performance from those states with weaker standards. There was an intervening recession, so he went back and did it again to see whether the recession made a difference, and he concluded the results were the same. Stronger environmental standards have not limited the relative pace of economic growth and development among the states over the past 20 years.
Thank you. Ms. Kerrigan.
I think we're definitely on the right track. I do think we need to be looking at this. Labor and capital is highly mobile in our global economy. I've traveled around the world working with governments and business leaders and business associations in developing and emerging countries who are looking at what they can do to make their economies more competitive, what they can do to attract investment, to help their small business sector. So, you know, there are other countries out there that know that they need to work on their internal processes in order, in order to attract investment, and it is very competitive. And quite frankly, they do want to eat our lunch. So I think it's important that we do, yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Ellig.
2 points. On the cost side, regulatory uncertainty. There's evidence that uncertainty does deter business investment, which may deter job creation. And my colleague, Dr. Richard Williams, 27-year veteran of the Food and Drug Administration, made that point in his submission in response to your request. Secondly, the broader point is regulation reallocates resources. We get more of some things as a result of regulation. We get less of other things. The less of other things is the cost side. That may show up as lower employment than we would otherwise have. That may show up as lower wages. That may show up as higher prices for consumers, or it may show up as less investment if we regard regulation as something that just comes out of profit. That's the cost of saying, well, we'll take it out of profit. We have less incentives for investment. Typically, those effects will be different for different industries and for different types of regulation, which is why it's so hard to generalize.
I thank the gentleman, and I note the attendance of the gentlelady from New York. I apologize for not catching you earlier. Ms. Burkle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the beginning of the formation of this committee and my membership on it, our chairman has charged us to go out and begin a conversation with all entities, businesses, small businesses, larger businesses, and our constituents to talk with them and listen to their concerns regarding regulations and how these regulations impede their success and how those regulations really snuff out the entrepreneurial spirit that has made this country the great nation that she is. So I'm delighted to be here today and have the opportunity to greet all of you today, and I thank you for being here. My first question is a general question, and I'll start with Mr. Gattuso, but then if anyone else would like to comment, I would certainly welcome that. At his State of the Union address, we heard the President speak about regulations and the need to get regulations under control so that we do not impede jobs and getting this economy back on track. I'd like to hear from you whether or not you think that that's a serious initiative that's going to be taken, or what your thoughts are about that.
I would like to think that it is a serious initiative, and I would welcome a serious initiative along those lines. I have considerable concerns, however, from what actually has been done so far. The executive order released by the President, issued by the President, only calls for preliminary plans for a review of regulations sometimes in the future. It is not the government-wide review that he has stated it was. It does not apply to independent agencies, who are some of the largest producers of regulations. And it seems each time he talks about this initiative, there's less and less on why we need to review regulations and more on defending regulations. So the tenor seems, the initiative seems to be perhaps fading already, which is a matter of great concern. Just to cap it off, I was very disappointed in his speech to the U.S. Chamber, where he seemed to rely upon cajoling business to hire, to claim moral imperatives, appeals to patriotism, basically jawboning, as opposed to real policy change. He even went so far, and actually a humorous note, said that he wished he had brought a fruitcake over to the Chamber of Commerce when he moved into the neighborhood to welcome them and establish a friendship. And that's good. We should have good relations between different factions in politics, but fruitcakes won't do it. So we need more than fruitcake economics to get this problem solved.
Thank you. Would any other members like to? Yes, sir.
Thank you for this opportunity to answer your question. I think the President is seriously interested in this, but he also feels the responsibility to do it in a balanced way, that these regulations and these laws are important because they also protect people and they protect the environment. And at least regarding some of the aspects of that, we also need to move ahead. Agencies have limited resources, and to the extent they're pulled off on lookbacks, of course, that also limits their ability to go forward. Finally, I think the President knows, to the extent we've done these lookbacks in the past, we've generally found that costs are less than projected at the time, and benefits are about the same as we thought. There have been very few lookbacks that have found that we're chasing after problems that are really not serious societal problems.
Just if I could comment on your response, I think that everyone on the committee is very concerned and interested in always maintaining the balance between public safety and safety in the job place, or whatever the issue is, but also the need to get this economy back on track and create jobs. So thank you.
I think time will tell. We're hopeful, you know, and we'll take part in the initiative with the White House. The key is, though, is that the initiative, the spirit of the initiative, also going to be implemented with the existing regulations that are moving through the system right now. You know, with the new health care, the financial service overhaul laws, you know, some of the things that are moving through the Department of Labor right now. Not only just to look back, but, you know, are we in fact, you know, looking at, you know, the cost on small business and what we can do to, you know, if they are going to move forward with these regulations, are they taking small businesses into account? You know, will they be exempted? Is there going to be an alternative that perhaps makes it easier and less burdensome for them to comply? But with these initiatives, it's a lot of time, energy, and passion that's going to be needed from the White House. And again, time will tell. we'll see.
Thank you. I believe we're out of time, unless I can.
I appreciate it. The gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you.
And with that, I recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank you, the witnesses, for excellent testimony. And as I was sitting here, I could not help but think about 40 years ago when I sat as an employee of Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore. And it was interesting back then that we spent a whole day just on safety regulations before we could do anything. But there was something that makes me feel very emotional as I'm sitting here, and that is that, and I did not realize the significance of it then, but I understand it now. At the end of the day, if you blew your nose, as a matter of fact, if you were on the premises for an hour and you blew your nose, black stuff would come out. Not trying to ruin your lunch, but that meant that we were inhaling. We were making a decent salary, Mr. Shapiro and Ms. Kerrigan. We had a summer job, which we really needed. One of the highest paying jobs that we could get, really, as a student after my 11th grade and 12th grade year. But we were also inhaling stuff that would kill us. And it was even more evidence, I have evidence of that, because a lot of the gentlemen that I work with who were making a lot of money died early. They're dead. They're no longer there for their children. Didn't even get a chance to see many of their grandchildren. They're dead. And I think that what we have to constantly keep in mind is this whole balancing act. And Mr. Shapiro, I think you said something that I haven't heard any of the witnesses talk about, and that is that it sounds like you were saying that when these regulations are made, government bends on the side of protecting human life, bends towards human safety and the welfare of people. I think that's what you're saying. And so I think that, and this keeps going on in my mind when I think about Bethlehem Steel, and I think about those people who are dead, and I think about the ones who called me when I was in college to tell me that they were suffering from cancer and all kinds of problems because of what they inhaled. And so I think that later on, when things came around and OSHA began to look at some of that, I think they began to require certain other things, like a mask, like a simple mask over one's face. So regulations do have a significant role to play with regard to life and death situations. And so I just want us to always keep that in mind. Some people want to try to make it look as if it's one side or the other. I think it's a balancing act. It really is. And no one wants to overburden business, but it's one thing to have a job. It's another thing to be able to go home at the end of the day and not be shipped off in a coffin. That's real. And so I think we have to maintain that. Now, let me go back to something else. We were talking about Conoco, and I want to make it clear, Mr. Shapiro, that Senator Lugar is no wacko. He's a brilliant man who I admire tremendously, well-respected Republican. He said, when he was talking about this provision, he said, the essential issue at stake is a citizen's right to hold its government to account. We cannot force foreign governments to treat their citizens as we would hope, but this amendment would make it much more difficult to hide the truth. And you can comment on that in a minute, but I need to get one thing in, Mr. Chairman, before I do that. I want to get some letters in real quick. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 3 additional letters we received for this hearing. These letters are from Robert and Susan Cirigliano, who lost their son Bobby when he was suffocated by a dropped side crib. Another letter from the small business, majority of small business advocacy organization that supports the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And finally, the Main Street Alliance, an organization that represents small businesses and supports the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. I ask that they be part of the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
And I see I still have 21 seconds. Mr. Spurrier, do you want to comment very quickly, because I've run out of time just about.
Representative Cummings, there's a very good reason that the agencies bend towards the protection of people trying to prevent injuries, cancers, and so on and so forth. That's what Congress told them to do in the OSHA Act and these other laws.
Right. Thank you very much.
I thank the ranking member, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Kerrigan, so in terms of small business, you say in your testimony that small businesses, well, first, they're important to the American economy, and I agree. And I think most Americans, middle America agrees as well. But you stated that small businesses bear a regulatory burden that is greater than a large business. Explain that. Just flesh that out for me.
Well, it's quite simple, and it's common sense that, when a new regulation is imposed on a business, whether it's a new tax requirement, a new reporting requirement, when there's compliance involved, that they just do not have the scale to, spread the costs around. And they don't have an accounting, many of them don't have accounting department, or they don't have a compliance person, or they don't have a vice president of safety. So, it is the business owner. It falls on them to, deal with that new regulation. They may have to, hire a consultant, perhaps bring on an accountant as a consultant, or perhaps, give them more hours, or what have you. So they just do not have, they can't, absorb those costs as easily as a large enterprise. And so, that is the spirit behind, in 1980, the Regulatory Flex Act, that there was, the common sense premise that regulation does have a disproportionate impact on small business, and therefore, the agencies do need to take that into account in terms of their regulatory actions.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Ellig, in terms of the Mercatus Institute does a report card of this regulatory burden. Can you mention that?
Oh, yeah, sure. Our project is essentially looking at the quality of analysis that Federal agencies do when they issue regulations, and then looking at, to what extent did they actually seem to use it in making decisions. And this is not, we're not trying to suggest that agencies ought to be in a straitjacket where they have some quantitative formula that they can only issue a regulation if the monetized benefits exceed the monetized costs, but rather we're looking for whether agencies actually, seriously considered regulatory alternatives. Did they actually define the problem they're trying to solve and explain the barrier that gets in the way of achieving whatever it is the regulation is supposed to achieve? Did they demonstrate that this problem exists, and so forth? So that's the kind of thing we're looking at.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to my colleague from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ellig, this question is for you. In your written testimony, you mentioned that interviews with agency economists often revealed that they faced pressure to modify their analysis of the regulations in order to support decisions that were already made. I wonder if you could expound on that for the committee and just tell us what agencies you were referring to.
Oh, sure. That is based on a study. There was a series of structured interviews of Federal economists in various health and safety agencies that was actually conducted by one of my colleagues, Dr. Richard Williams, shortly after he left the FDA. And that was one of the generalizations that he drew from his interviews. Personally, I have heard stories of agency economists saying that they were told things like, on a Friday, come back and put more benefits in this analysis, or don't bother showing up for work on Monday. I think among economists who do this kind of thing for a living in Federal agencies, it's well known that they're going to get some pressure to come up with an analysis that supports whatever the agency has decided to do, whether it's an increase in regulation or a decrease in regulation.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate it, and I certainly appreciate the Chairman giving me the opportunity to sit in the chair. And it's a mighty big chair for a guy my size. So With that, there are no more questions today. So with that, the committee stands adjourned.